Welcome everybody. This is the latest Twistica North East member. This is Rita. She's my new mascot. So anyway, she's going to have a little rest. But before that, she's just going to introduce Richard, who's going to do the first half of the talk. So he's going to do a little talk called "The Floor is Lava."
Yeah.
Is that right?
But mostly mud and water.
Mud and water, yeah.
So call it catastrophism.
He's going to tell me how the Earth's going to end, basically. We're all doing it. And then Ben...
Could you hold your hands against the dog ears so you don't get...
Sorry. And then we'll have a quick changeover, we'll have another cup of tea, and then Ben will do his performance, and then we'll have another cup of tea, and then Ben will do the second half. So you're going to be here probably till 5 o'clock. So, but yeah, there's plenty of tea, coffee, snacks and everything, so don't give up hope. You're all right.
There's beer in the fridge.
All right. And there's beer in the fridge if you want beer. And there's also wine, and there's also gin and tonic. Oh dear, it's getting like a speakeasy, isn't it? So turn your phones on to silent if you can, please. And I'll leave you in. Richard's capable hands. Richard, my son, by the way, my adopted son. There's his mum.
Quick, let me put her in the car.
He's too fast. Are you sure you don't want to stay? No, you're fine. Tomorrow's, are you sitting there tomorrow? Tomorrow's sitting there. You're fine. I don't know.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the talk. It is a bit difficult putting these kind of things together and having a full-time job and trying to have a social life and stuff. My degree's in Earth Systems and Planetary Science, which is something I'm actually really interested in, geological processes and geomorphology and sort of how the world used to look. I apologise in advance if it sounds a little bit like a geography lesson to start with. Everything I'm going to talk about it's got catastrophism at its crux, and you could maybe call it the next end of the world. Here's a cartoon that probably many of you have seen before a few times. There's a few different depictions of it. This is my favourite one. Like the dinosaurs just missed the day the ark set up. Oh crap, is that the day? The animals went in 2 by 2, but not the dinosaurs. Right, what's catastrophic? We've had impacts that wiped out the dinosaurs. We know it wiped out the dinosaurs because there's a layer of iridium in the geological record all around the Earth. Floods usually happen during El Nino and El Nina events. These are during solar maximums and minimums, and they have catastrophic flooding in kind of Southern America and India. Earthquakes. These are an effect of kind of what's happening from space, as is the floods. Volcanoes have been kind of recently, which I'm going to talk about a bit later on. And of course, solar events. I find it particularly unusual in the mainstream media that they'll hammer the global warming myth home, and they'll talk about a whole range of other kind of things, but they'll never talk about the sun, which governs everything. Catastrophism goes back to kind of the 18th century. Jean-André Deluc, he was trying to prove that there was a biblical flood, and he was trying to prove the flood in Genesis. A flood which I think happened. It's just when you start writing stuff down and it gets translated over time, it becomes a bit of a Chinese whisper. This guy I really like, Georges Cuvier. Oh, that's Baron Cuvier. He was particularly fascinating. He had a whole range of. He was a paleontologist, a botanist. He was a really clever geezer. But his real curiosity was catastrophism. He kept going to look at this strata of rock in Paris, and he wondered why the fossil layers were intermittent with these layers of absolutely nothing, mud with kind of no fossil record in them. And he thought something must have happened to make it so that nothing was living, so it's not trapped in the fossil records. Yet later on you have fossils, no fossils, fossils, no fossils, fossils, no fossils. So he realised that these things were earmarked by periods of catastrophe. He didn't know what the mechanism was, neither did a lot of people, and scientists at the time who were coming up with these new theories and concepts. They were up against the kind of religious dogmas of the day. You know, a lot of people still held on to these religious beliefs that were quite hard to get past. These are the magnetic events. I'm going to talk about these later on. And when it comes to talking about catastrophes, there's various groups and people over the years who've tried to put dates on the end of the world or various catastrophic events. And these are usually done through, during the Leonid meteorite shower in 1833, there was a group of people called the Millerites, and it was kind of all group were crescendo when the local town drunk heard that they were all going to poison themselves upon hearing the trumpet of God. So he got on his push bike and cycled past with the trumpet at midnight and all took the poison. And so it was a bit of a catastrophe for them. But anyway, like I say, that's not an isolated case. As you know, pseudo-scientific mistruths always come into it, and I know a lot of you are going to hate us for saying this, but things like ancient aliens and some of the things you see on the History Channel, although I agree in principle a little bit with the saying, I think things like that, they're there to entertain you, not to educate you, and they look at the most kind of outrageous side of what it could actually be without saying things like, well, you know, humans have been around for probably a lot longer than we consider, and civilizations have been around a lot longer than we consider. So you've got to be aware of pseudo-scientific truths. Are you trying to be entertained? Or are you trying to educate yourself? Academic ignorance is a massive one, and I really feel for people like Graham Hancock, who are fantastic in their fields. However, because they haven't done a university degree in what they're talking about, we can't listen to them. We can't even look at the work. Professor Rupert Sheldrake, who's a Cambridge professor, wrote a book about an interconnected field where all that kind of memories go. I haven't read the book, but on his TED Talk interview, he says that he approached the other professors in the university about, and he says, he put the theory to them and he's going, that's preposterous. And he says, well, have you looked at my work? They said, we don't need to look at your work. And that's a Cambridge professor. So that's what you're getting through academic ignorance. If you haven't got a qualification, they won't even entertain you. So at least I've got sort of a qualification to talk shit in what I'm talking shit about. 2000, the Millennium Bug, well, we'll do that. It got a lot of computer programmers very rich very quickly because everyone needed, oh, my computer's going to break down. It didn't. We're still here today. 2012, Ben's going to talk a little bit about 2012, but 2012, we all know how that ended, didn't we? You know, there was all these kind of suicide, and I have to admit, I was kind of caught up in it when I first heard about it, but it turns out that 2012, the Mayan calendar, wasn't even in the popular consciousness till someone wrote a book about it in 1975. The name of the author eludes us, but nobody knew about 2012 anything until 1975. I got caught up in it, but when you look at the astronomy that was happening that day, it all makes a lot of sense. Nothing was ever going to end. Okay, dates on the end of the world scenarios never come to fruition. Dates on truth movement, big issues, never come to fruition. Be very careful on slapping a date on things. QAnon was quite prevalent at this. I don't discount QAnon, I just think, you know, when you say Hillary Clinton and the rest of them shitbags are going to get arrested on the 4th of September, and they don't, you know, it kind of fills you with, like, a bit of despair, doesn't it? So I wanted her to get arrested that day. Here's a brief timeline of what I'm going to really talk about, which is kind of the end of the last ice age, where there was a lot of flooding and a lot of ice melting and sea levels rising and stuff. So anybody on coastal regions at the time going for a shock, like say around 1400 BC, the ice sheet starts to melt. Then you get a brief period called the Younger Dryas, which I'm sure you've heard about in a million documentaries by now. You get a period of refreezing. Then the Boreal period is where we start really hearing about history written down and recorded. And this is things like Noah's flood and Atlantis and things like that. Although I sort of count Atlantis towards the Younger Dryas. Isostatic rebound, and this is a thing you come across quite a lot, and in our country, a lot of our earthquakes, they're only little 4-pointers and stuff, but they're due to a phenomenon known as isostatic rebound. I'm going to do a quick demonstration for you here. I'll just get my books because it demonstrates better. So what you've got is the Earth, and the Earth, the crust floats on the asthenosphere. There's different layers, I know, but when you put load on, like say a 2-kilometre deep ice sheet across hundreds of square kilometres, and you've got land here, kind of the isostasy, which is things floating in So you get land rising and falling, and then when you get ice sheets melting, it takes that weight off and land rises elsewhere and floods elsewhere. Does everyone get ISOS to see? Good, there'll be a test later on. But like I say, in this country, certainly around our coastal regions, there's probably a lot of rising and falling went on. The earliest evidence for British civilization, well, we found a rib with a horse carved into it that dates back about 12,500 years, but there was a paleontologist and a botanist called William Buckland. He heard a rumour that there was some elephant bones in a cave on the Gower Peninsula down by Swansea, so intrepid as he went down there with a rope and just kind of abseiled down, and he found a skeleton of what he thought might have been a Roman prostitute or something, but later on the skeleton got dated and it turned out to be about 31,000 years old, and it's called the Pavland Man if you ever want to go and have a read around that. With the advent of the kind of Victorian age and the lack of scientific processes, you had a place called Aveline's Hole, which is in Somerset, so I believe, and that place literally got raped of its antiquities and things because people didn't know about archaeology, how to do it properly. There was so many artefacts got ruined and thrown out and just smashed up with bad techniques. But we've been occupying this isle for a lot longer than they'd have you believe. This is a map. I don't know why I kept it in, probably because I like it so much. I'm going to talk about this strange island here in a little bit, but this is a map by Gerard Mercator, and he was good friends with a guy you might all heard of called Sir John Dee. And when Sir John Dee seen this map, he thought, how can we put Britain on this map? And this was the kind of like the first inception of the British Empire, when Sir John Dee showed this map to Queen Elizabeth I. And we're like, whoa, we've got to get a taste of that. And we went on to conquer quite a lot of the world, didn't we? But like I say, there's a strange island there. I had a lot of maps in this talk, but I didn't want it to turn into a map first, and I didn't want to end up banging on about maps, because that's a whole different thing. Now, Doggerland, you might have heard of. I prefer the term North Sea land because of the connotations of the word dogger. Basically, Doggerland, where the North Sea is now, it was steadily sank into the sea after the last ice age. It was a very rich land full of trees and hills and streams they've dredged up things like mammoth bones, deer bones, hunting tools, but it all started in 1931 when they dredged up a bit of peat off the Dogger Bank region. But it's called Doggerland coincidentally because the Dutch fishing vessels were called the Dogger boats, and the Dogger Bank, where most of them fished, is a particularly shallow region. This was the top of the Dogger Hills, which was probably the last place to sink in Doggerland, and the last bit of Doggerland probably sank around 8 BC when the top of them hills sank. Like I say, it's the possible home of Paleolithic civilizations like the Frisians, who I'm going to talk about, who I don't think get enough credit for who they were. Here's that's like just off imagination about Doggerland, and like I say, it's got very rich forested areas around kind of the northern fringe of mainland Europe. And here's Dogger Bank here. Coincidentally, Dogger Bank is one of the only regions in the sea that's owned by somebody, and it's owned by Crown Estate, and they're building a massive wind farm there, probably the biggest offshore wind farm in the world, but coincidentally it's a bit of an undersea estate owned by Crown Estate. Okay, so like I say, the coastline was very different about then, so about 16,000 BC, you can see, like if we could go back to 16,000 BC, and they're not sure about the ice sheet extent, so let's say it's here, and we just went down to timeout, the coastline would look a hell of a lot different around 16,000 BC. There'd be a lot more trees and stuff, but it was a lot more low-lying to the north, and it was very luscious to the south. Here's another schematic that shows that the Thames, the Rhine and the Seine were actually the same river when Europe was all one bit of land, and we know this through sonar. Yes, these are just like kind of artistic depictions of how people think Doggerland might have looked. And here's the harpoon that was first dredged up in 1931, and this is on display in Norwich Museum. and it was quite a sophisticated harpoon for, like I say, for these cave knuckle dragon cave dwellers. The coastline was more or less shaped by 3 massive landslides. A bit of the continental shelf just off the coast of Norway slid into the sea in 3 different phases. The bit of land that got dislodged was probably about the size of Scotland, so you imagine all that rock sliding underwater, created like 10-metre waves around the shores of Britain, probably wiped out a lot of the bell beater people who were living in Britain at the time. Like I say, the collapse involved an estimated 290 square kilometres, about the size of Scotland, and it really did shape our coastline. It would have killed a lot of people. Especially on the Shetland Islands, it would have just washed right over the Shetland Islands. Now, the Sterega slide was probably around here, and you'd see all this kind of detritus. Again, sorry, I don't mean to go into geology lessons, but here you've got the North Atlantic spreading ridge. This is where the sea floor is spreading apart, and you've got like volcanic mountains here. It sort of looks like it here, but to me, this feature here looks like an impact. And this is what Graham Hancock and others are saying ended the Younger Dryas period, the last ice age. This impact basin, I emailed the professor at university, and he said it was probably a product of a spreading ridge of the North Atlantic opening, but I kind of disagree, because I've looked all over Google Earth and I can't find another feature like that. There hasn't been any paper or research done on this particular feature, but I think that's an impact basin. If you have a look at this, this is the Rockhall Trough, and anybody who can do jigsaws can tell this bit of land used to be attached to that bit of land. The question is, how long ago? I think it was at the end of the last ice age, when you had the Sterega slides, and this bit of Britain just got ripped off the continental shelf, and a lot of this area would have still been above water. I think this is where Hyperborea or Friesland or possibly Atlantis might have been. Atlantis is it's a long throw, it's a long stretch, maybe not Atlantis, but certainly Hyperborea and Friesland, because with the extent of the ice sheet, if it came down here, this area would have still been privy to the jet stream, so you'd still get kind of warm weather, sort of like what we get now in this region. So I think the world probably looked a little bit different at the end of the last ice age. And here's a historical record from it. Now, this is quite ambiguous.
No battery, please charge.
Like I say, this book's really ambiguous. I've scratched the surface. It's an alleged historical record from 2194 BC, and it's written in Old Friesch, and it's a record of a place called Atland, which I know sounds a bit like Atlantis, but actually translates to the old land. And it was an heirloom handed down through generations of the Over de Linden family, and Cornelius Over de Linden actually inherited the book from his Aunt Yaffe. Now his Aunt Yaffe, she died before anybody had a chance to ask her any questions about it, so that's where the story becomes a little bit frustrating straight away. It's been kept in the Archives of Tresor, which is a museum in Leeuwarden, which is in Friesland in the Netherlands. Okay, and it's taboo to talk about this thing. They keep it hidden away. It's not even on display, because the story goes there was a priest, a Protestant priest called Francois Haverschmidt, and Francois Haverschmidt used to write poetry because he was a bit disillusioned with being a preacher and everything, and he was disillusioned how everybody took the Bible literally, and he wanted to convince people that the Bible's not meant to be taken literally. So he got together with people like Elko the Juice, who we're going to hear about in a minute, and they put together this magnificent work of fiction and give it to Cornelius de Linden to go, hey, look what's been in my family forever. Now the thing about Cornelius de Linden, he was, sorry I forget some of the facts sometimes, he was the chief superintendent of the Royal Dockyard at Den Helder. Now, people who work in dockyards and who've got a history of shipping and everything, this is where all these like old artefacts come from. But now, the Oralenda book, because it goes back so far, it's too fantastic for people's brains to kind of accepting, oh, it must be a forgery, it must be a fake, but I'm not too sure about that. And there's all kinds of arguments that go into that, like I say, I haven't had a chance to go into yet, which is about the script that it's written in, the iron that's in the ink, the paper that it's written on. These are all future investigations, but on face value, it's easy to debunk. But like I say, when you start looking into it, it becomes very strange. There's the last two entries in the book come from 803 BC. That's from Lyco over Delinda, and he says, "Beloved successors, for the sakes of our dear forefathers and our dear liberty, I entreat you 1,000 times, never let the eye of a monk look upon these writings. They are very insinuating, but destroy in an underhanded way all that relates to us Frisians. In order to gain rich beneficiaries, they conspire with foreign kings who know we are their greatest enemies, because we dare to speak to our people of liberties, rights, and the duties of princes." So you all know that the duties of kings, probably from the days of the Greeks, were to hoard wealth, enslave people, and not treat people fairly. The crux of what's going through the Auralinda book is the opposite of that. It teaches people freedom, that the earth's got enough resources for everybody, and that everybody you should put virtue over wealth, and you know, all these kind of virtuous messages. And the last entry in the Auralinda book, and this is why so many people are going, oh, well, it can't be true. It was written in the 14th, 15th century. It's because he wrote on different paper, and this is why. Hidu over Delinda in 1256 wrote, and this is the very last entry in the Auralinda book, "Okay, my son, you must preserve these books with your body and soul. They contain the history of all our peoples, as well as our forefathers. Last year I saved them from the flood, as well as you and your mother, but they got wet and began to perish. In order not to lose them, I copied them on foreign paper. In case you inherit them, you must copy them likewise, and your children must do so too, so that they never be lost."
Wow.
And that was the last entry in 1256. Now, when it came to light, like I say, Cornelius over Delinda give it to a guy called my Dutch is terrible, Elko Verjuis, I think he's called, and he dealt with ancient languages, and he immediately recognised it as ancient Frisian. Now, a fella called J.O. Ottoman got hold of it, and he wanted it for the Friesland Museum, and at the time there was a lot of Frisian nationalism going on. And when you look at who's actually writing the historical record, but most of our historical record comes from Greeks and Romans. They always claimed they were fighting barbarians. Now, barbarian just translates to somebody who's not Greek. I think these people, the Frisians, lived on Dogger land or Friesland, had their own cultures, their own traditions, and they certainly weren't barbarians. And I think the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, they inherited a lot of what the Frisians were saying. As you know, there's a kind of rumour that a lot of the pharaohs were red-haired white men. Frisians, they were Frisians. Like I say, it's very taboo in the Netherlands, and I've literally scratched the surface of this. If you want to read the Auralinda book, there's a lot of PDFs online. It ends very abruptly as well. It ends in like the way that The Sopranos ended, halfway through the sentence. Right, and here's a map by Niccolo Zeno from 1558. This actually shows Friesland. So there's a lot of other maps. But what's particularly interesting about Niccolo Zeno's map is he's got the longitude nearly exactly the right place, which was unheard of for the 1500s. We didn't have a chronometer that worked till the 1700s, the mid to late 1700s. That's because to work out longitude, you have to have a clock that works. Now, clocks work on the principle of pendulums, and a pendulum on a ship doing this, it just wasn't going to be accurate ever, was it? So the chronometer wasn't actually invented till the 1700s. So how the hell did Niccolo Zeno, who probably copied these maps from source maps, know where to put the longitude in 1558? I've got a whole plethora of other maps like this, by the way. I just didn't want to put them in and talk about maps forever. Right, going on to the cosmic aspect of catastrophism, and it's the sun. It is always the sun. There's a CIA cover-up. It involves the galactic current sheet, which we're currently going through. Superflare or micronova. Micronova is a bit ambiguous, but a lot of people are becoming more swayed to the fact that the sun doesn't, stars don't just supernova the micronova, they puff off the outer layers. Superflare is just as bad as a micronova. If you get a bad enough flare, you're screwed. Pole reversals, I'm going to talk about magnetic excursions, and pole reversals are similar but a bit different. Impactors always come after anything puffs off the sun, you'll get impactors, and surviving. It's a book written by Ken Wright based on his father, who was Major Maynard White. He took the 46th and 72nd Reconnaissance Squadron to the North Pole. They had to go to the North Pole to map it because at the time they were just in the start of the Cold War, and finding the North Pole and navigating over the North Pole was becoming more and more imperative. That's why they actually went there. But when they got there, they found that there was magnetic anomalies all over the place, and there was these layers of rock that had recrystallized coral in them that were like way beyond the latitudes that they were meant to be at. So you know, how can you have coral in frozen latitudes? It's because during the past million years, 43 different areas of the Earth's surface have been on or very near the North Geographic Pole. The average distance is about 1,500 miles between them, so the Earth must move. It must move. Like I say, there's besides various mechanisms for the pole flip, and the jury's still out on this, and a lot of people will debate it. It's a very basic schematic of what they're trying to say. And if you get the Earth and flip it 90 degrees, so the Earth's got a magnetized crust, so if the pole wanders, it's going to drag the magnetic crust with it. But to what extent it moves and flips, we just don't know. The jury's completely out. Some people deny it altogether, and some people say it's just to do with plate tectonics, which is the slow geological creep of the tectonic plates over time. But does it happen quickly? I don't know, I haven't got any answers. But these things were talked about in the Pentagon, and Major White was there, and a whole bunch of other people. Charles Hapgood was there, what I'll talk about later. They didn't want to tell people about it, but scientists, they were like, well, we do want to tell people about it, but we don't know how to release it. Then the information was actually released in a short newspaper column, and people ignored it. But to be fair, how many of you would honestly read an article about geology? How many? Oh, look at this. At the time, pretty much the interest in geology is what it is today. It's sparse, it's a niche subject. Okay, so when it did appear, they got no responses and thought, so it's okay. But they did realise that people were getting very close to the truth. And like the UFO phenomena, we can't tell the public. You can't tell the public because they'll panic, there'll be chaos in the streets. Nah, people can generally take these kind of things, aliens especially. Now this guy was there, you probably all heard of Charles Hapgood, especially if you've seen the film 2012. He led an amazing double life. He was a respected university professor, he taught different disciplines at different universities. But he was also in the OSS, he did a lot of geophysics for the OSS, and he was instrumental in making the OSS into the CIA. I'd say he had a tremendous double life. Now, Charles Hapgood was at that meeting in the Pentagon in 1948, and he realised that, he probably realised that people shouldn't know this, and we need to steer people away from the information. So what he did, he put out an Earth crustal displacement book in 1958, which was easily debunkable. It had a different tilt, different poles. His argument was, it was crap, his argument, and it took down the whole field of catastrophism with it. So when anybody mentioned catastrophism, they thought, oh, Charles Hapgood, oh yeah, he's a crackpot, oh, the Earth's slipping around the shadow, that's stupid, it's preposterous. But that's what happened, it took the whole field of catastrophism down with it. Now, more and more people are looking towards catastrophism. Maybe what they didn't know about the sun then, we know about the sun now, and I think there's a lot of very rich, powerful people know the same thing. Now, let's see if I can play this soundbite from Chan Thomas, read by Ben Davison. Please work.
for that speaker?
Yeah, I'll play that later. Basically, what he's saying, it's a very fantastical Hollywood version of events about the Adam and Eve story, the next disaster, the next end of the world, and it would be easily dismissed if it wasn't classified by the CIA. There was loads of books about disasters and catastrophism at the time that they let you read. Chan Thomas, he got classified in 1965 because his book, as fantastically Hollywood as it sounds at the beginning, about 2-mile high waves crashing eastwards across continents, earth fire, getting inundated. It's right, but what was particular about his book, he's got the poles meeting in the Bay of Bengal, which is exactly where the poles are headed. That's exactly where the poles are headed. The CIA knew it, the Pentagon knew it, Charles Hapgood knew it. Chan Thomas worked it out on his own, and he got his book classified. Now, it got re-released in 1993, but it was a very sanitized version of the book. And like I say, it would have been easily dismissed by anybody if it wasn't classified. Why was it classified? Because he knew what was coming. Here's a page that is in Chan Thomas's book. Again, you can get the PDF online, and there's a lot of this kind of ancient stuff in it because he's looking at the Adam and Eve story and the Noah's flood story. This one's particularly telling. It's Plato, and it's telling the story of Solon, and this is the most telling bit. The greatest having been brought about by earth, fire and inundation. And he's saying the earth ends lots of times and nobody's kept historical records because you've just done things through word of mouth. So every time it happens, you turn into what Graham Hancock calls a species with amnesia. You quickly forget. You're like a head injury patient. We come back as children going, what the bloody hell happened? I'm going to make stone tool. And that's literally what happens to it. But I think, you know, certain rich people can survive this. They've got spaceships and all kinds of things. And I think these are the gods that they talk about when, you know, they reintroduce themselves to the planet. And go, oh, hello, look at the technology we've got. Well, anybody with technology would be looked at as a god. Well, we can't do that. How does he do that? It's magic. He must be a god. Right, the Janabekov effect. This is something that happens in space. This is also something that slows me talk right down.
In particular, this update pertains to the Janabekov effect, the intermediate axis theorem, where that asymmetry causes simple rotation to result in tilting based on the severity of the asymmetry after a period of seemingly quieted and calm spin. Whereas the wildly popular YouTube channel Veritasium claimed this did not apply to Earth because we were pretty symmetrical about the spin axis, we countered with the evidence that we are not symmetrical in any way, shape, or form as a planet. The outer parts we can see tell us that. The subduction zone, homes of all Blot Echo earthquakes ever, snitch on the asymmetry. And of course, the LLSVPs, the large, low shear velocity provinces, the pluming, thicker, conductive protrusions from the core mantle boundary up into the mantle and fingering up to places like Hawaii and the East African Rift. As you might infer from those facts, they indeed spring out opposite sides of the core, like internal handlebars, one below Africa and the other below the Pacific. Symmetrical indeed. It is sort of inane at this point in geophysical knowledge to consider the planet symmetrical in any way, and when we went over in the series just how serious the electromagnetic forcing of the entire planet can be by the sun, I can remember looking back at all that evidence and thinking to myself, what's next? They're going to tell us the Earth's core is lopsided perpendicular to the LLSVP internal handlebars, and that T-shape actually does.
Yep, they do. And what he's basically saying there is some of these, the hotspot volcanism, you probably know as Hawaii, the Canary Islands, the East African Rift. There's particularly hot spots of like magma coming up there, and it's making the planet lopsided, which adds to the Janabekov effect, which is where you spin something in space, it'll tilt and then go back to its spin, then tilt and go back to its spin. Does it happen to Earth? Don't know, but it's a very strange effect. Here's a GIF of just it's a bigger picture of what he was showing there. So there, the hotspot volcanisms create an imbalance in the Earth that can easily lead to the Janabekov effect on Earth. It's all coming, like I say, from the sun. It's a large fiery ball at the centre of the solar system, in case you missed it. I was talking about before, solar kill shots. This one happened just 2 weeks ago, and if it was December, we'd be screwed.
Right now, when we were on the other side of the solar system, we would be in very big trouble. 2 massive solar eruptions, each capable of causing electrical disruptions on Earth, would have begun to arrive today, and could be sending our planet back to a time before electrified technology.
Yeah, so these solar kill shots, like I say, they mightn't kill you, but there'll be no telephones, no internet, no television, no electricity, no emergency services coming to help, no hospitals, nothing. So solar kill shots, you don't necessarily have to fry. Magnetic excursions, we're having one now. They happen roughly every 12,000 years. We know this from Corin in these places, and what happens is these areas are particularly heavy in sediments. When the sediments lie, the iron and manganese in the sediments line up with the Earth's magnetic field, and you can tell by looking at the minerals where the actual Earth was, that particular part of the Earth was, based on the latitude and the tilt of the magnetic minerals. That happen, I'd say, every 12,000 years. The Earth the magnetic field does this. It happened over 12,000 years ago now. We're long overdue now. A magnetic excursion isn't a reversal. It's like a bit of a flip. It kind of undulates a bit and then it'll flip and then flip back. We haven't had a full magnetic reversal for over 725,000 years. We're long overdue a full magnetic reversal. So your compass will point south. And when that happens, I don't know what happens to the Earth, and I don't like to speculate, but when we have an excursion, and if you go back to the picture in The World in Peril, about the Earth turning over, as the Earth turns and the land, due to angular momentum, the ocean and the atmosphere is going to want to keep going in the same direction, which leads to supersonic winds, water racing across the land at huge velocities, and it'd be very hard to survive. But like I say, that's where the catastrophism lies. The ocean and the atmosphere wants to keep going in the same direction. It won't agree with the Earth, and it's going to obliterate everything. Questioning some modern science, I'm going to question climate and cosmology here. Cosmology especially. There's the dark matter milk carton. Dark matter's missing. It was last seen. Never. What's its height? We don't know. What's its weight? We don't know. How much does it cost? Well, it's cost about 120 billion to find this thing that they haven't found. And yet they're still asking for funding. I'm not saying the search for it hasn't yielded some results in different places. Them large hadron colliders and stuff. We've learned a lot about fundamental physics and quantum physics by building them, but have we found any dark matter? Have we fudge? Nothing. Yet they're asking for more billions to find it. It's not there. It's hidden in plain sight. The sun, they'll still have you believe it's a big ball of gas. I think that's ambiguous because gas doesn't have a surface. I'm not going to get into thermodynamics, but there is a theory out there called the liquid metallic hydrogen model. I urge you all to go and look at it because it fits a lot better than the gaseous model. We've still got all them horrifying effects coming from the sun regardless of what it's made of. So no getting out of that. Climate science is a massive failure. I'm probably preaching to the choir here about climate science. It's failed to predict the future on numerous models. In fact, nearly every model it's failed to predict the future. Do you remember a guy called Al Gore with his scary, the poles will be melted and the temperature will be this high? Every single measurement that we've taken has come in under the scary temperature ranges. Past climate, they can't even agree with each other. Academics, paleontologists, they just can't agree with each other. They can't predict the past. Like I say, with the Earth crust displacement and the slow creep of geologic time, they can't even agree about that. CO2 oversensitivity in the models and the bias CO2 on heat. Oh, it's this anthropogenic global warming, which means it's man. But if you scale the Earth to the sun, I'll give you an example. If you took every bit of matter that wasn't the sun in the solar system and squeezed it together and popped it in the sun, it'd be just less than 2% of the sun's mass. Yet we're led to believe that 1 billion or so people using aerosols and CO2s causing the atmosphere to change. It's actually laughable. But that's not to say we're not doing bad stuff. We are. But like I say, they favour these low sensitivity models to solar forcing. When I talk about solar forcing, I mean all the bad stuff that the sun's spitting out with X-rays, gamma rays, electrons, protons, and all these subatomic particles that we're getting bombarded with. And the melting polar ice caps, well, if they do melt, it's going to trigger an ice age, not global warming. The future is cold, not warm. Unappreciated force in volcanoes, which I told you I was going to tell you about. Volcanoes have been very, very kind to us recently, over the last 100 years. That's the effect that the volcanic sulfate injections had on the atmosphere. If you go back to about here, this is Krakatoa. And do you remember some of Turner's paintings had the fantastic skies and everything? That was an effect of what Krakatoa did. We haven't had one this century or last century. Volcanoes have been very kind to us. Wait till they started going off. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. Total solar irradiance. In 2017 there was a big solar flare hit us, and it showed up as a drop in total solar irradiance, which is upper atmospheric heating. So what did the CO2 Barbie Brigade say? Oh, well, you see, we're told your solar forcing doesn't do anything. It's actually dropped off. Well, the heat was dropping off. X-ray intensity increased by 1,000 times. We've got bombarded by 10,000 times more particles that we get bombarded by. These things like solar rays, solar particles, they lead to cloud formations. They give nucleation sites for clouds to form. So more clouds, more albedo, more heat loss, more cold. The future is cold. But like I say, this is how they con you with the CO2 thing, and don't look at the sun. It doesn't mean anything, because it's a drop in heat when we get a solar flare, but it's also a massive rise in all these other solar forcing aspects. The sun's changing. Does anybody remember the yellow-orange sun? Do you remember the yellow-orange sun? Remember the yellow-orange sun? If you try and have a look at it now, it is blinding white. That's because the sun's chemistry is changing. The helium abundance in the sun is changing, and it's been changing for the last 4 years. The sun's not yellow anymore. These are two guys you need to look out for. Ben Davison from Suspicious Observers. His was the voice commentary on what you've seen. And this guy is the biggest genius on earth as far as I'm concerned. He's Dr. Pierre-Marie Robitaille. They can't really attack him because he's a real doctor. He works in magnetic resonance imaging and all kinds of other imaging. When he puts his process into looking at things on space, he's published all these papers. It was him who came up with the liquid metallic hydrogen model. He's got a YouTube channel called Sky Scholar. I have to say, unless you're heavily into physics, tries to make it easy to understand, but he goes into a lot of the minutiae as well, which even to me goes, what's that? But yeah, it's well worth watching, and he talks about new theories and concepts in physics. There's a Dumbo on YouTube called Professor Dave Explains, and he's trying to debunk these guys, and a guy who's not a professor, calling himself Professor Dave, who's a YouTube pop scientist, trying to debunk somebody like this guy. It's hilarious, isn't it? But like I say, Dr. Robitaille has produced all these papers, and even Ben Davison himself, his degree's in law, so he doesn't get taken seriously. Oh, your degree's in law, you can shut up. But he's got a lot of people behind him. Suspicious Observers, got 500,000 citizen scientists, me being one of them, looking at the evidence that they produced. There's even some high-up anonymous people from NASA agreeing with what he says, but obviously they can't come out and be like, hey, he's right, because they'll lose their jobs and stuff. This is me conclusion. The current massive narrative about, mainstream narrative about carbon dioxide is an overblown, unscientific, money-spinning myth. More importantly, it perpetuates fear. The coming solar event may come tomorrow or in 50 years, but it's coming. When it does, it will be hell. The few survivors will quickly find themselves in a new stone age. Sadly, the survivors will be the likes of Bezos, Gates, and the billionaire offspring, who, with advanced technology, whom the other survivors may seem like gods, and indeed may become the Viracochas and Quetzalcoatls of the new age, the age of Aquarius. It's coming, and they know it. Coincidentally, has anyone seen Knowing with Nicolas Cage? Yeah. That's what's happening. Yeah. that's about the closest thing to a disaster film I can point it to what's coming. And unless anyone knows any aliens to come and pick what up from a car park somewhere. I don't know how to get out of it, I really don't. And finally, people, not every person, but if you go to a beach on a sunny day and you go to enjoy the birds and the sounds of the ocean, and you're met with Bluetooth speakers playing loud dance music and cans of Strongbow dark fruits and plastic in the ocean, it's, come on people, what a bunch of bastards. And that's because of our throwaway society. Like I say, there's absolutely nothing we can do with anything coming from the sun, but the stuff we can do on Earth, yeah, you know, we all live on this rock, despite what it's going to do to us. We all live, yeah, we can all privy to clean water, lack of plastic in our oceans, clean food to eat, air to breathe. Why can't we have that? So when people, my advice, when people start talking to you about the global warming myth, get them on the page of pollution, because that's a tune we can all dance to. Let's stop pollution, we can fight that. We can all sing to the same tune there. And like I say, thank you, Truth Seekers North East, and I'm going to hand you over to Ben after your nice cup of tea.
When we do the changeover, help yourselves to tea and coffee. I'd just like to present Richard with a Truth Seeker North East t-shirt. And a Truth Seeker North East hat.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Did you all enjoy that?
Yeah.
Wasn't it interesting?
Yeah.
Obviously there's no hope. We're all going to die. Watch the film knowing, I mean, spoiler ending, good. We're all going. Okay then, right. Computer changeover, help yourselves to tea, coffee, snacks. And we'll be back in 5 minutes with Ben.